Two teenagers stand on a Southside sidewalk with nothing but pride between them and fate. A bump happens, words fly, and then a pistol comes out. Seconds later, the #1 ranked high school player in America is laid out, bleeding into the pavement. Chicago's biggest hope gone before he even touched the NBA hardwood. His name was Benjamin Wilson, but everybody called him Benji, and his story is still one of the most painful in the city's history. How did a kid with everything going right end up gone at 17? Benji Wilson grew up on the South Side in a neighborhood called Chatham, a place that carried two different stories at the same time. Chatham had block parties, neighbors who knew each other, and families who tried to hold things together, but it also had crime, poverty, and the growing presence of gangs moving through the area. Born March 18th, 1967, Benji was the youngest of three brothers, and his family knew early he had something different in him. During the late 70s and early 80s, Chicago was being pulled into the crack epidemic and violence was climbing every year. By 1984, there would be 669 homicides in the city, and much of that violence touched the South Side. Still, Benji's family stayed close, determined to keep him away from distractions, because they all saw how basketball was shaping his future. Even as a teenager, Benji had a strong sense of discipline, saying in one interview, "I have a goal and I want to be successful. So when I get home, I study, do my work, and go to class." That attitude wasn't common among kids surrounded by gangs, quick money, and violence, but Benji knew he had to choose discipline. He spent countless hours working on his game, often with his brothers, making sure he stayed focused and grounded. By the time he hit high school, everybody in the neighborhood already knew Benji had next. The kid was tall, skilled, and determined, and in a city where talent often got swallowed by the streets, his focus made him stand out even more. Benji enrolled at Neil F. Simeon Vocational High School, better known simply as Simeon, and right away he started to separate himself from the rest of the city's young hoopers. Standing at 6 feet 8 inches tall and still growing, he wasn't just another big man clogging up the paint. He had guard-like skills that shocked people who saw him play. Coaches and scouts compared him to Magic Johnson, only this kid had a reliable jump shot to go with the vision and the handle. As a sophomore, he cracked the varsity lineup, becoming the only underclassman to start on the team. That was when people outside of Chatham started noticing him, because it wasn't normal for a sophomore to already be holding down a varsity spot in Chicago's public league. By his junior year in the 1983 to 84 season, Benji led Simeon to the school's first ever Illinois Class AA state championship. Even though he only scored 4 points in the title game because of foul trouble, his teammates stepped up and the win was sealed. His impact that season was so strong, he still made the all-tournament team. And from that moment on, Chicago basketball was officially on notice. The summer of 1984 changed everything. Benji attended the Athletes for Better Education camp, better known as the ABCE camp, where the best high school players in the country came to showcase their talent. That camp was loaded, but Benji dominated so much he left ranked as the #1 high school player in America. Coaches and scouts could barely believe how smooth he was at 6'8", calling him Magic Johnson with a jump shot, words straight from his own coach Bob Hambrick at Simeon. By fall of 1984, Benji was the most recruited prep player in the country. DePaul University, Indiana University, and the University of Illinois were all chasing him, hoping to lock down the Chicago star. Packed gyms became his normal life, with NBA scouts and college recruiters lining the stands. Every time Simeon laced up, it was more than a game, it was a showcase of the future. Nick Anderson, who would later go on to star at Illinois and play for the Orlando Magic, was one of Benji's closest friends and teammates. He understood better than anyone that Benji was carrying more than just a basketball dream. For the city of Chicago, especially the South Side, Benji became a symbol of hope. He represented the idea that a kid from Chatham could rise above poverty, gangs, and the violence that swallowed so many lives in that era. By the start of his senior year, he wasn't just another high school star. He was the one everybody pointed to as the future of Chicago basketball. The kid had the skill, the height, the attitude, and the work ethic to become the next legend out of the city. People whispered that he might someday rival Michael Jordan, who had only just begun his NBA career with the Chicago Bulls. That was the type of buzz Benji carried at just 17 years old. Chicago was proud of him, Simeon was behind him, and the whole country was paying attention. Benji Wilson was bigger than basketball in 1984. He was the hope of Chatham, the South Side, and Chicago, and the future looked locked in for greatness. Benji was shining on the court, but off the court, things started getting complicated for the young star. His relationship with his girlfriend, Jatoon Rush, was already rocky, and in mid-1984, she gave birth to their son, Brandon. Being just 17, Benji was still a kid himself, and now he had the responsibility of fatherhood before he ever touched college ball. Classmates at Simeon remembered seeing Benji and Jatoon arguing in the hallways, with heated moments breaking out in front of everybody. One incident even ended with Benji shoving a teacher who tried to break up the situation, showing how stressed he was at that time. He was frustrated because Jatoon was pulling away after the baby's birth, and he didn't really understand why she distanced herself. People close to him said Benji loved his son and wanted to be present, but he was still juggling the pressure of being the #1 high school player in the country. He was trying to balance fatherhood, his relationship, schoolwork, and the heavy spotlight that came with his name. That type of weight on a teenager is enough to break most people down, but Benji kept lacing his shoes every day. Even when drama followed him into school hallways, he stayed locked into practice sessions, workouts, and team responsibilities. He was still focused on that next step, still locked on playing at the college level and maybe even the pros. His life at 17 was a strange mix of bright lights on one side and heavy personal problems on the other. But through it all, he never let go of that dream he carried since he was a kid, shooting in Chatham. To really understand Benji's world, you have to understand Chicago in the mid-'80s. In 1984, the city recorded 669 murders, a huge number that showed how bad violence had become. On the South Side, groups like the Black Disciples, Gangster Disciples, and Vice Lords had major influence, with turf wars spilling into schools and neighborhoods. Kids walking to class in Chatham or Auburn Gresham had to watch every corner because trouble could come quick. Even with all that chaos, Chicago had something else that united people, and that was basketball. Public league games packed gyms from Simeon to King High, with crowds lined up before the doors opened. Hoop dreams were like another religion in the city, with pride attached to every team and every block. When Simeon played a rival like Crane or King, it felt like the whole neighborhood was in the stands. Chicago had already sent stars to the NBA like Isaiah Thomas and Mark Aguirre, and people believed Benji was next. Scouts said his mix of size and skill made him the most complete player they had seen in years. Sports writers were already calling him Chicago's Jordan before Jordan, a kid who could dominate at the highest level. For many in Chatham and the South Side, Benji was proof that good choices could lead to something greater. He stayed away from gangs, he stayed focused on basketball, and he represented the type of story people wanted their kids to follow. Community leaders like Reverend Jesse Jackson even pointed to him as an example of what could be achieved by staying disciplined. Every time he stepped on the court in that blue and gold Simeon uniform, the city leaned in closer. People wanted to believe he would break the cycle that swallowed too many kids. To them, Benji wasn't just a player. He was the one carrying the hopes of Chicago basketball into the future. Tuesday, November 20th, 1984 started out like any other school day at Simeon High. But for Benji Wilson, it was the day that would decide everything. Simeon was preparing to open the season against Evanston Township, the same team they had beaten in the Illinois State Championship earlier that year, and anticipation was running through the hallways. Everybody expected Simeon to make another championship run, and every set of eyes was focused on the #1 ranked player in the country. Instead of spending lunch with his teammates that afternoon, Benji decided to step away and look for his girlfriend, Jatoon Rush. Their relationship had been strained for months, and with the game coming up, he wanted to clear the air. Around 12:30 p.m., they walked along South Vincennes Avenue near 81st Street, right outside Simeon's campus. Jatoon was upset and walked ahead, while Benji followed a few steps behind, trying to get her attention. At that same time, two teenagers who didn't belong to Simeon were hanging outside a small luncheonette on Vincennes Avenue. 16-year-old Billy Moore and 16-year-old Omar Dixon had both skipped school from nearby Calumet High, and Moore was carrying a .22 caliber revolver inside his jacket. The day before, Moore's cousin had been robbed of $10, and Moore had initially thought about retaliating. That situation had already cooled down, but he was still armed when he and Dixon drifted into Simeon's neighborhood. Witnesses later testified that around the luncheonette there were 5 or 6 boys standing near the fence, with students walking in and out for food. As Benji followed Jatoon past the store, he brushed shoulders with Moore. The 6'8" forward wasn't paying attention, and he bumped the smaller Moore without even realizing it first. Moore reacted immediately, yelling at Wilson to watch where he was going. Benji had already taken a few steps past, but when he heard Moore's words, he stopped and turned around. That decision created the chain of events that would end with the city losing its brightest star. The 2 teenagers exchanged words, with witnesses saying that Dixon stepped forward and confronted Benji face to face. Dixon allegedly grabbed Benji's jacket and demanded money, asking if he had anything in his pockets. Benji shoved Dixon away, telling him to back off, and the situation escalated quickly. One account stated that Dixon tried to reach into Wilson's pockets, pushing him a second time while asking for money. Benji pushed him off again, refusing to give him anything. The taller Wilson stood his ground, frustrated and heated, while Moore watched from a few feet away. According to testimony later repeated in court, Benji might have said something like, "What you gonna do, shoot me?" As the standoff reached its breaking point, that line, if spoken, was more about pride than reality, but in that moment, it gave Moore the opening he would never take back. Moore pulled out the .22 revolver and fired directly at Wilson. The first shot hit Benji in the midsection, leaving him stunned and stumbling. He ducked behind a nearby tree trying to shield himself, but Moore fired again. The second shot ripped into his left groin, severing his femoral artery and causing catastrophic bleeding. In a flash, the #1 ranked high school player in America was on the ground fighting for his life. Jatoon Rush turned just as the second shot hit him, and she screamed as she saw him collapse toward her. Witnesses remembered her trying to catch him and lower him down as he bled into her arms on the sidewalk. The entire confrontation had lasted less than a minute, from the bump to the bullets. Moore and Dixon immediately ran from the scene, disappearing into the neighborhood while classmates and bystanders panicked. One student, Sean Bayless, later testified that he saw the entire encounter from inside the store window. His account, along with Jatoon's words, became crucial to reconstructing exactly what happened that afternoon. Sirens started to echo across the south side within minutes, with an off-duty police officer nearby already alerting dispatch. But for Benji, lying on the pavement in front of his school, the damage had already been done. The hopes of Simeon, the pride of Chatham, and the promise of Chicago basketball were bleeding out right there on Vincennes Avenue. The shooting happened around 12:37 p.m., and the first calls for help went out immediately. Teachers and students crowded around Wilson, trying desperately to comfort him and stop the bleeding with their bare hands. Jatoon cried as she held his head, begging him to stay awake while the crowd looked around for help. But in those crucial minutes, the city's system failed him. The ambulance didn't arrive until nearly 40 minutes after the first call, a delay that became one of the most painful parts of this story. By the time paramedics finally reached Vincennes Avenue, Benji had already lost enormous amounts of blood. Following Chicago's standard procedure at the time, the ambulance took him to St. Bernard Hospital in Englewood. That hospital was the closest available, but it was a small community facility without a trauma unit. Wilson needed immediate vascular surgery, but hours passed before he was seen by the right specialists. His aorta and femoral artery were already severely damaged, and the bleeding kept getting worse. Back at Simeon, teammates were pulled from class and gathered in the teacher's lounge as coaches tried to shield them from the worst news. At first, they were told Benji might survive, but as the evening went on, the updates grew darker. The city began to spread word that the #1 player in the nation was in critical condition. By the early morning of November 21st, 1984, doctors knew there was nothing more they could do. At around 6 a.m., Mary Wilson, Benji's mother, made the impossible decision to remove her son from life support. Hours before Simeon was scheduled to open its season against Evanston, the Wolverines lost their leader forever. Benji's blue and gold number 25 jersey hung in the locker room that morning, untouched, as his teammates sat in silence. The season would still begin, but Chicago's brightest star would never step on the hardwood again. The morning after his death, word spread across Chicago like wildfire, and the city fell into collective heartbreak. Simeon High School became a gathering place for students, teachers, and community members who couldn't believe that their brightest star was gone. A candlelight vigil was held at the school, and over 8,000 people showed up to pay their respects, lining up outside and around the block just to stand together in silence. On November 24th, Benji's body lay in state in the school auditorium, and thousands filed past his casket to say goodbye. The following day, November 25th, the funeral took place at the headquarters of Operation Push, the civil rights organization led by Reverend Jesse Jackson. The service drew over 10,000 mourners, including Mayor Harold Washington, who sat alongside grieving family members, teammates, and classmates. Reverend Jesse Jackson delivered the eulogy, using the moment to push the city and the nation toward action. He spoke about the epidemic of youth violence, demanded stronger gun control laws, and told everyone that Benji's death should never be treated as just another statistic. People left the service devastated, but also motivated, repeating over and over, he was supposed to make it out and he didn't. Despite the grief, Simeon's team still chose to play their season opener against Evanston Township the same night Benji passed. With tears in their eyes, the Wolverines took the floor, and the gym echoed with chants of Benji as they secured a victory. The players said afterward that they felt like their teammates' spirit was with them, pushing them forward. That game became more than a win. It became a statement of resilience for a city struggling to cope with losing its number one player. Even as Chicago mourned, police wasted no time identifying the shooters responsible for the tragedy. Within hours of the incident, investigators began piecing together accounts from witnesses at the luncheonette, and the names of the suspects were already being whispered. 16-year-old Billy Moore and 16-year-old Omar Dixon were quickly identified, with several classmates pointing directly to them as the ones involved. Moore had been seen earlier with the revolver, and his name surfaced repeatedly when police canvassed the neighborhood. By the evening of November 20th, police tracked him down to the house of Erica Murphy, a girl he had met near Simeon that day. He was hiding out at her home, but officers arrived around midnight and placed him under arrest without incident. Shortly afterward, they located and arrested Dixon as well, bringing both teenagers into custody before 24 hours had passed. At the police station, the boys were interrogated separately, and both eventually signed written confessions. In those early statements, Moore admitted to pulling the trigger, while Dixon was described as the one who grabbed Wilson and demanded money. The confessions even included lines suggesting that Dixon urged Moore to fire, with words like "pop him" allegedly shouted before the gun went off. Those statements would later become points of controversy, but in the moment, they gave the prosecution a clear narrative. Both Moore and Dixon were charged with murder and attempted armed robbery, despite their age, and prosecutors immediately announced that they would be tried as adults. Chicago newspapers splashed their photos across the front page, describing them as gang members who cut short the life of a future superstar. The gang label spread quickly, even though no formal gang evidence was ever presented, and the public treated them as hardened criminals from that point forward. The arrests brought some measure of relief to a grieving city, but they didn't stop the anger. For Chicago residents, it wasn't enough to know who pulled the trigger, because the bigger question remained unanswered. How could two teenagers with no connection to Wilson take his life so casually on a sidewalk in broad daylight? That question hung over the city as the case prepared to head into court. The trial of Billy Moore and Omar Dixon began in Cook County during the fall of 1985, and it attracted heavy media coverage from across Chicago. Prosecutors Kenneth Malatesta and Arthur Hill led the case for the state, determined to prove that the shooting was the result of an attempted robbery. They leaned heavily on the written confessions both boys signed the night of their arrest, as well as eyewitness testimony from students who were there. The state's star witness was Jatoon Rush, Benji's girlfriend, who testified that she saw Dixon grab Wilson's jacket and demand money. She also claimed that she heard Dixon say, "Shoot this punk," just before the shots rang out, pointing the jury directly toward a robbery scenario that escalated into murder. Another student, Sean Bayless, backed up parts of that story, saying he saw Dixon confront Wilson before Moore pulled the gun. The defense team pushed back hard, with Isaiah Gant representing Moore and Brian Dosh representing Dixon. They argued that their clients were being railroaded because the victim was a local celebrity, saying that the authorities wanted to punish someone quickly to calm public outrage. Moore's lawyer insisted that his client only pulled the gun because he felt threatened by the much taller Wilson, who stood nearly a foot above him and looked ready to fight. Both boys quickly recanted their confessions, claiming the police pressured them into signing statements they didn't fully understand. Dixon's lawyer made headlines when he dramatically tore up a copy of his client's confession in front of reporters, calling it worthless. The defense pointed out inconsistencies in witness statements, highlighting how some details like the line, "shoot this punk," didn't appear in initial interviews. Despite the arguments, the jury didn't deliberate for long. After about an hour of discussion, they returned guilty verdicts for both Billy Moore and Omar Dixon on charges of murder and attempted armed robbery. The swiftness of the decision reflected how strongly the evidence stacked against them appeared to the jurors. At sentencing, Billy Moore was given 40 years in prison, while Omar Dixon received 30 years. Both sentences were considered heavy for 16-year-olds, but the court treated the crime as an adult-level offense. During the sentencing hearing, Moore addressed the Wilson family directly, offering what he called his deepest apology and saying he never wanted to be the one to steal their son's dream. His words didn't soften the pain for the family or the city because nothing could replace what was lost on that November afternoon. The trial closed the legal chapter of the case, but the debates over what really happened on Vincennes Avenue were only beginning. Chicago was left with a conviction, a grieving family, and the endless feeling that a legend was stolen before he had the chance to truly live. Even after the trial ended, debates and rumors kept Benji's story alive in the streets. People argued over whether the shooting was truly a robbery gone wrong or just an ego clash that spiraled in seconds. The prosecution pushed the robbery narrative, but Moore later said it was never about money, only fear and panic. One rumor spread quickly that the killing was actually a planned gang hit, carried out because certain people were jealous of Wilson's fame. No evidence ever supported that idea, and Moore himself admitted he didn't even personally know Benji before that day. Another false rumor claimed that Jatoon had some connection to the shooters, maybe tied through friends or classmates, but investigators never found proof of any link beyond her tragic presence at the scene. There was also the story that Benji taunted Moore by saying, "What you gonna do, shoot me?" before the trigger was pulled. Some witnesses supported that version, while others insisted those words never came out. What is clear is that both teenagers traded heated words before Moore made the choice to fire. Years later, Moore gave interviews saying he shot because he felt scared, not because he planned a stick-up. He also claimed that Omar Dixon had little to do with the actual shooting, a statement that conflicted with the court record. The media's quick decision to call both boys gang members also added to the confusion, because the judge had actually barred prosecutors from introducing any gang evidence in court. These myths formed because the city needed answers for something that made no sense. When a 17-year-old with the brightest future in the country is taken away in seconds, people will always search for explanations. After Wilson's death, Simeon retired his number 25 jersey, though for years they gave it only to the program's best player as a tribute. Nick Anderson wore it, Derrick Rose wore it, and Jabari Parker wore it, each carrying his legacy into new generations. In 2009, the number was permanently retired, locking his name into Chicago basketball history. The shooting also changed Chicago's emergency medical system, as officials mandated that gunshot victims must be taken to the nearest trauma center instead of just the closest hospital. That reform has been credited with saving countless lives. Mary Wilson, Benji's mother, became a strong anti-violence advocate and wrote a book titled To Benji with Love. Before her death in 2000, she made her sons promise to forgive the shooter. That moment came in 2020 when Anthony and Jeffrey Wilson publicly forgave Billy Moore on stage, even handing him the spent bullet casing that had been removed from Benji's body. Moore was released from prison in 2004, became a youth counselor, and later lost his own son to gun violence in 2017. Omar Dixon struggled after release, eventually landing back in prison on weapons charges. Brandon Wilson, Benji's son, grew up, played basketball, became a police officer, and tragically died in 2022. Back on that sidewalk in Chatham, one bump turned into 2 shots, and a dream disappeared forever. Benji Wilson was supposed to be Chicago's answer to Jordan, but instead he became a cautionary tale for every kid with talent and hope. His story lives on through number 25, through forgiveness, and through Chicago's fight with violence. The number one ranked hooper never got his chance. And the question remains, how many more Benjis before it changes?